Just a brief outline of where we're going to talk about today. Just a bit of background about myself, because I'm sure most of you guys don't know who I am. Background about lameness, why I think it's important. Some crystal ball gazing, because part of what I was asked to do is like, where do we think the future is going to look like, and where are we going to go, and how are we going to get there. Then we're going to talk about the present, so where are we starting from, and then I'm going to present my steps to the future for how do we get from A to B. So who am I? I'm a vet that graduated in 2002. I worked part-time in private dairy practice for a year. And during that time, from about 2001 to 2008, I operated a dairy farm, 50-cow freestyle dairy farm, which compared to Canadian and Ontario standards is just a little bit under average. Then I completed a DVSC, which is kind of like a PhD in the last 4 years. And it was basically, I did a project entitled Lameness in Ontario. So how much lameness was there? What are we doing about it? What are some producers doing about it? What's working? What's not working? And for that, I worked together with 5 hoof trimmers who did a lot of the legwork and recorded a lot of the lesions. So currently, after I've actually sold the dairy farm this spring, and now I'm operating Cramer Mobile Bovine Veterinary Services. It's basically all things feet for Ontario dairy cows. I offer bovine foot care, so hoof trimming, also some research and consulting that I'm trying to develop. So that's kind of the background about myself. I got interested in lameness during last year of my vet school, and ever since then, my whole project was on it. But basically, I've trying to make a living on lameness. So hopefully, I'll put myself out of business, because that would, I think, to be the best thing for the industry. But I think we have a long way to go. So how do we define lameness? I think we can't talk about lameness without discussing what we mean. Well, if somebody's come up with a fancy definition saying lameness is due to a disorder of the locomotion system and due to reluctance or dysfunction of pain in the limb. Well, that basically means you're a 3-legged cow or cows that are reluctant to walk. But I think going by that definition, we're missing a whole bunch of cows, which we call subclinical cows, so cows that maybe aren't showing us that they are lame. And what about those are cows with foot lesions that have no detectable alteration in gait, so we can't really tell what's going on? Are these the cows with arched back, toes in or toes out? And then there's a couple questions with this definition too. A, how do we know which lesion is painful? Do we press our finger on it? Does that mean she's painful? It's a pretty crude measure, because I have her tied up in a chute and I'm pressing my finger on it and I'm hoping she responds. Well, that cow's got a million other things going on in her head. So if we press on it and say, well, that lesion's painful, there's some questions about that. And then I think a bigger question is, what does a normal cow walk like? I think a lot of people would be surprised by some of the cows that I pick out as lame, and other people say, well, that's just the way she walks. And I think as an industry, we could do some there. So just to kind of divide lameness into 2 broad categories. There's ones that are focused on upper limb or body, and then there's foot lesions. I want to focus on foot lesions, and we can divide those into 3 big main categories: infectious lesions, hoof horn, and other. And I'm just going to go through which ones I mean. So for infectious lesions, when I mention them, I'm talking about foot rot, digital dermatitis or strawberry, and heel horn erosion. Basically, what I want you to remember about these lesions is a 4-letter word or a 6-letter word. It's called manure. If we think of infectious lesions, it's bacterial in origin. But if we think of manure, it eats the horn, it softens it, it grows the bacteria, and it spreads it. So when we're going to talk about prevention, I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds. When I talk about hoof horn lesions, I'm referring to ulcers, and they can be either at the typical spot in the sole, at the toe, or at the heel. White line disease, along the white line here, or hemorrhages throughout the sole, or white line. I group things, so I have pretty basic categories. And what I want you to remember about hoof horn lesions is standing time. If a cow's not standing, she's not going to get hoof horn lesions. Yes, there's a lot of other things that go on, and somebody's going to make a big discovery one day and tell us exactly how they happen. But if we remember, the latest thinking is that this little bone, we call it P3, is attached by separate ligaments to the hoof wall. So this is the hoof wall. This is the sole. What we think happens is for something like ruminal acidosis, there's enzymes that get released, and they kind of work on these ligaments and cause sinking of this bone to either crush the stuff that grows the horn here, or in this spot for a typical sole ulcer spot. But we have to remember, if a cow's laying down, nothing happens because there's no pressure there. So the one thing I want you to remember is standing time, and it's not just acidosis. The same hormones that cause the relaxation of the ligaments to push the calf out cause relaxation of these ligaments. So when we're thinking about what causes lameness, maybe we need to consider things that happen around transition time too. And then there's some other lesions that I'm basically only going to discuss right now. There's deep sepsis, vertical wall cracks, just a crack starting at the corium and growing down. Thin sole, so that's overwear or over trimming. And then corns, everybody's favorite, and nobody knows what to do with it. So what's the future going to look like? Part of my talk was, okay, what's the future going to look like? I'm not sure if everybody can read this, but this came across, I think, the Newswire about a week ago. And it read, how about a double scoop of mama's milk? This is PETA's proposing that Ben & Jerry's starts using breast milk in their dairy products. I think this is not what the future is, but we all know about PETA and we all realize what they're trying to do. But this is what we're dealing with as people that are trying to set our future. So what's a more realistic version of the future, and why should we care? PETA cares because they know that welfare is a hot button issue. And I think after this year, nobody needs to be reminded why welfare is. But just in case you've been sleeping this year, there's been the Humane Society videos, all the stuff going on with RBST, and then coming down the pipe, and I think it's already here in the States, are welfare audits. So why do we really care? And what drives me is this little girl. She's also my daughter, but what do I tell her when she asks a question about this cow when she's walking? She knows what that feels like because she's probably jumped off something and went, ow, my foot hurts. So when she sees a cow limping, she realizes that cow's in pain. What other disease can a girl walk into a barn and say, that cow's in pain? Hard to do for mastitis unless the cow's down. Maybe an RP because it stinks, but a DA, some of the other diseases we can't tell. But a cow like that, she's a huge red flag. Everybody can relate to her. Rightly or wrongly, they assume she's in pain. I think she is in pain. But that's why lameness is one of the key diseases from a welfare standpoint. So if we look at welfare audits, because they realize the same thing and they realize they need to control lameness, they've come up with some standards. They would like to see on a 5-point scale, so this is all basically based on the Sprecher or Zinpro scale from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They want to see less than 15% of the cows with a score 3, 4, 5 for NICHAP, which is the New York Welfare Program, or, well, part of it is a New York Welfare Program. Validus has a much more stringent score, less than 5% of the cows. And I think 2 pens, they want to see the scores of 3, 4, 5. And then 5 stars, so that's dairy quality assurance. They want to see less than 3% of the cows at 4 to 5 score. That's where the future is. That's what people, or people that have set the welfare audits, that's what they're expecting. How are we doing? Well, to answer that question, there's only been basically 3 studies in North America that kind of address the current situation. So that's the present. This is just the different colors represent the different locomotion score, and then there's a 75th percentile in that study and the mean or median of that study, so the average. If we just focus on the red bar, so that's all the cows with a 3, 4, and 5. If we look at, let's see, example, the 15% for NICHAP, if we go across, nobody meets it. Our 50%, everybody's above it if we look at the median. If we look at the 75th percentile in Minnesota, that's about the 75%. That means 75% of the herds would fail a welfare audit. And that, if we go back just to remember, this is the most generous one. If we look at 5%, for 3, 4, 5, so nobody is going to meet the 5%. So basically the welfare audits as they're created right now are aiming for the top herds. Probably the top 2, 3% of herds across the country would maybe meet that standard. So that's what the present situation is. I think the present situation, if we were to implement welfare audits across the industry, majority of herds would fail. So that raises some questions about the standards themselves. Are the standards appropriate? And I have some serious questions about that. Is locomotion scoring the right tool? Or are we measuring the right thing? Is prevalence the right thing to measure? And the other question is, how do we get there? How does the industry overall, how do we get to an average of 25 to 30% of your cows lame at one point in time? How did we get there? What happened? What are we missing? What are we doing wrong? And if we look at this over history, if we go back and look at some literature, it's basically been the same for the last 10, 20 years. So it's not like we've created a recent problem. I think We've been there for a while. We're just starting to wake up to it now. So the answer to the question, is locomotion scoring the right tool for the job? This is 2 studies, one done in Ontario, one done in New York. It has different locomotion score across the bottom, and then the bar shows what percentage of cows have lesions. So this study, cows with a score of 5, 100% of them had lesions. But what I want to point out is that these cows, score 1 and 2 in this study, about 20% of the cows with a score 2, which would be non-lame cows, had a lesion. And in the Ontario study, it's a little different scoring system, but about 40% of the score 1 cows still had a lesion. So if we're thinking these cows are normal, they still have a lesion on their foot. And that's where we get back to the question, are these lesions painful? What else is going on in the cow? But if we think, if we're basing 26 and 6 makes about 30% of the cows are lame, and yet a lot of these cows have lesions, but there's still 50% of those cows that we consider non-lame still have lesions on the foot. Maybe locomotion scoring isn't the right tool. And I think we need to consider that. If we look at cows with locomotion score, if they're lame, then more than likely they have a lesion. If they're not lame, so they're category score 1 or 2, they probably could still have a lesion. And we need to consider this point. I think we need to figure out which lesions are painful, and we need to consider the goal of locomotion scoring. If we're going to use it as a tool in a lameness program, we need to consider if we're trying to find cows with a lesion. So if you find a lame cow, there's a good chance she has a lesion. But if you're trying to find cows that would benefit from an intervention that you're going to help along as a screening test, so basically you're trying to find cows with problems, I'm not sure locomotion scoring is the best tool to use. Now to answer the other question, how did the industry get there? And to do that, we have to understand 2 terms. We have to understand prevalence. So if we measure something today, if I go around the room and ask who's feeling a little under the weather today, 10 people stick up their hand, that would be a prevalence number. If I were to ask how many new cases, how many people in the last month have been sick, and 20 people stick up their room, that would be an incidence measure. So when we measure something over time, number of new cases, that's an incidence measure. And they're related. So prevalence is a function of incidence, so how many cases over the time period, how good we are at looking, how soon after we find the new case do we do something. So if you have a cough, and this is a new cough that you have, do you wait 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you go to the doctor and see what's going on? What kind of lesion is it? And how long does once we take action, how long does the recovery period last? And why am I going through this? Because I want to kind of show how we got to this point. Chuck Gard, this is all based on data from Chuck Gard out of New York. He's done some prevalence modeling based on data from a 3,000 cow herds. And in that herd, there was a 28% lameness prevalence. And he used that in the model for 1,000 cow herds. This is the incidence of lesions. So throughout a year, 40% of the cows got a sole ulcer. 36% of the cows had digital dermatitis, white line disease, and foot rot 2%. And this is the recovery period that was put into the model just to kind of come up with the scenarios. Now people might say, well, this is a pretty high rate for a herd. To be honest, if we look across the world, those are probably pretty typical numbers worldwide. And then for the model, to try and answer the question, how do we get to a 28% prevalence level, we vary detection efficiency, so how good we are at looking or finding lame cows, and how often we did it. So this is a graph that shows you just a timeline for how many weeks for about a year's worth of data, a number of lame cows, and this is the magic number which we're trying to get to. We're trying to model a prevalence of 28%. So if we go and look for lame cows weekly, and we find 75% of the cows that are actually lame, after a brief introductory period, we end up with a lameness prevalence of about 12%. So that's, with all those incidence figures, like the 40% of cows that have ulcers, and some of the assumptions I showed you before, if we look for lame cows weekly and find 75% of them, this is the actual prevalence. So I'm going to show you some more, and then we're going to kind of tie it all together. If we do weekly detection and only find 25% of the cows, we end up with a prevalence of 16%. So we're focusing on the blue line. The pink line is just the number of cows that you've actually found in that time period. So now we're going to go, I don't only have the labor to look weekly, I'm only going to look monthly. and we're going to find 50% of the cows. So if I look monthly, we end up with a prevalence of around 20%. So we're getting closer to the number where the industry is at, or where this herd's at. Now, if we look monthly and we find 25% of the cows that are actually lame, we end up with a prevalence in this model at 29%. And just for interest's sake, if we do a weekly detection, so we look weekly, and we miss 92% of the cows that are actually lame, we only find 8% of them, we end up with a prevalence of just under 28%. So the bottom line, I think, from this herd, our high prevalence in our dairy industry is due to our poor efforts at finding lame cows. We don't know how to find them, basically. We don't know what to look for, and once we look for them, are we treating them appropriately? But I think the biggest key is we don't find lame cows fast enough. If we can find them fast enough, and we can do something about them, the first slide showed us, even with those high incidence numbers, we end up with a prevalence across the board of 11% of lame cows. Granted, this is all based on one herd and one model, but it just kind of shows us where we, I think, as an industry have to go. We have to focus on finding the lame cows. So I've basically presented some pretty not so happy news. So I think I'm going to switch gears and kind of say, okay, what can we do about it? Is there a silver bullet? And I think there is a silver bullet, but you're not going to like my answer, because it doesn't come in a bottle, and it doesn't come in a box. It doesn't come in a big $30,000, $40,000 machine. It's your management. It's producers management. It's advisors management. It's everybody working together. And I think we need to start by creating a program. How many producers are in the room here today? So there's a few. If I ask you, what are you doing for mastitis? Most people could rhyme off exactly what their goal is for the mastitis program, I would bet. Right? So what would be the first thing you'd say? You don't have an answer? Most people would say, I want clean, dry udders, basically, right? That's what everybody's been drilled in their heads. Clean, dry udders, put the unit on when the teats are full of milk, but clean, dry udders. If I asked that same question for lameness, what would you tell me? Yeah, because you can read, but what would you have told me that before you walked in the room? A lot of producers go, well, I have a program somewhat. I foot bath once a week, maybe once a month. I get the foot trimmer out when I think of it. That doesn't address the concern. I think if we compare mastitis and lameness, they're basically the same feet, same idea. If we imagine the claws or hoofs as teats and design a program that treats them the same way, we go a long way to solving both diseases, because they're interrelated. The same things work together, but we got to treat them like we treat teats, or at least have our approach to it be the same. We don't have to go to this extreme with pedicure and everything else, but I think we have to change it, our focus from being haphazard, oh, we're going to address lameness here, and we'll think about it here. We have to make it a program and say, this is what I do for lameness on my dairy. So what do I think you should do? Well, this is my steps to the future. I think the number one key after the last couple slides, we need to find and treat lame cows early. We need to record what we're finding on these cows. Then we need to focus on comfortable, clean, and dry feet. We need to consider foot dipping. I put foot dipping because I want you to think of teat dipping. Ensure proper weight bearing and minimize metabolic stresses. And they're basically in order of what I think you need to do too. But how do we do this? I think it takes an industry-wide approach. Everybody has to work together. People that are advising the dairy producers can't just say, well, you're not training your labor, you're not putting enough emphasis on it. Hoof trimmers can't just say, well, I come in and trim your cows twice a year, or every cow gets trimmed twice a year. I'm doing my part. We all need to work together. Nutritionists, support industry, dairy equipment companies, we all have a place to play in this program. And even builders, we can't take shortcuts when we're building barns. We can't leave puddles on concrete floors. We can't say, well, if you do something like this, it will save you X amount per stall, because that might save you X amount per stall today. But we've got to think of the long-term future of that foot that we're shaving off a corner here or there. So we need to consider it as a team. So how do we ID in lame cows early? There's two methods, basically. I think there's visual, and then there's automated. I think there's problems with both systems out there. Labor, for the biggest complaint probably for using visual or manual detection is a labor issue, and training. How are we going to train? What are we going to tell them to look for? And who's going to dedicate the labor to do it? Who's going to stand there on the exit from the parlor and look at every single cow and says, maybe you need to see the hoof trimmer, maybe you don't. Or who's going to walk the pens to do that? Sure, I'm from Ontario. It's easy to do that for 100 cows. Some of your bigger herds, do we need to go to automated systems? I think there are some automated systems on the market today. I think they still need some further evaluation and research. I think my personal opinion is that our automated systems are not going to be one machine where we just walk the cows across and we find a lame cow and says, you go to the hoof trimming chute, you keep walking to your pen. I think it's going to be some complicated programming is going to have to go on and figure out where the foot's placed, maybe the force, the activity. Maybe this is one that people use in research, an accelerometer, so it can tell me when the cow's laying down, how many steps she's taken, where she is in every position in the barn, and milk production. I think we need to tie these things together and come up with a way to identify lame cows early. Because this is a quote from a vet from Spain who's basically trying to run a hoof trimming business as a vet. His approach, he thinks it's time to change our approach. He thinks we should focus on finding and properly treating lame cows instead of trimming every cow twice a year. He says, forget those trimming twice a year. What I want you to focus all your time and energy on is finding those lame cows. If there's time left after that, then trim cows with ugly feet, poor locomotion, cows that are walking funny, or cows that have chronic history. And then he says, then we focus our prevention efforts on the things like standing time, locomotion, heat stress, and nutrition. I'm going to talk about those more, but I'm not quite ready to go to this extreme, but I think in our larger herd, this might be something to consider. Because this guy he's not just working in small little herds. He's working in the same size herds as you guys are in the States. He does some consulting with herds in California and stuff like that. But his approach is forget focusing all our energy on making sure every cow gets trimmed twice a year. And I think based on what some of the graphs from Dr. Chuck Gerard, I think we can make a big difference if we do that. But once we find them, what do we do with these cows? I think we need proper treatment. And especially for hoof-horn lesions, the goal is to take the weight off. I think this is based on a study. We need to use blocks and ulcers. But if we look at how often do people use blocks and ulcers, in a study in Ontario, about 20% of the cows that needed a block got a block. So that means we're leaving 80% of the cows walking around with an ulcer or an abscess on their foot, and we're not treating them appropriate. We're not probably meeting their basic need for treatment. It'd be like going to the doctor, having a broken leg, this is an extreme case, and not getting crutches to walk on. And then for digital dermatitis, I'm a pretty simplistic guy. I think tetracycline is probably your thing that's going to do it for you. But I think the whole key is we need to properly treat these lesions. And then the next step I think we need to do is we need to record what gets found. We need to record the cows that get lame. We need to record what we're finding on these cows. Because if we know what's going on in the cows in your herd, we can design a program specific for your herd. We don't need to say, well, you need the foot bath every day. You need to focus on heat stress and stuff like that. If we know you have a digital dermatitis problem, we can focus our energy on that. If we know you have way too many ulcers, we can focus our energy on that and maybe still do a basic infectious disease program, but we don't have to spend as much energy on it. But if we go into a herd and we say, I have a lameness problem, and we say, well, what kind of lameness problem? It's very hard to come up with a cost-effective program if that's all we know, we have a lameness problem. So we need to know, if you employ a hoof trimmer that works on your dairy, get him to write down what cows he's working on. If you hire somebody to come on, make sure he leaves you a sheet of paper that you can enter into your record system one way, shape, or form. And why? Because it allows us to look across time. We can look across and say, hey, what happened here? Did we have about 100 less lame cows this week? Or did the hoof trimmer go on holidays? And if I tell you that the blue bars are strawberry foot rot or digital dermatitis, why does it fluctuate so much from week to week? Is there a foot bath program that maybe starts 1 week, we get a reduction, and then we build up, and then we foot bath again? This allows us to ask questions if we have that data at hand. It also allows you a way too complicated graph, but it allows you to look across lactation and say, okay, what lesions are happening when in lactation? It allows you to say, okay, Are we getting way too many ulcers around 60 to 70 days in milk? So maybe we can focus on our transition period. Or are they happening later in lactation, 150 to 100 days in milk? So maybe there's something going on at peak milk. If we have that data, we can answer those questions, and we can go back and make specific designs for your herd. So how do we address, once we know what we have, how do we address specific lesions? This is kind of a basic program that I think people should follow. I think if we're going to focus on infectious lesions, the number 1 and 2 goals are to reduce the exposure to our 6 or 4-letter word. We reduce exposure, then focus on treating existing or preventing preliminary lesions and increase immunity. So reduce exposure, if you're not sure what I mean by that, clean up the environment, focus on clean, dry feet, because we've got to remember, the manure and dirt are the source, and they're also the medium of growth and spread and transfer. And we don't think we have to go to this extreme where we have to pressure wash every single foot cow, but it's something to consider. I'm just going to show you some pictures. 2 barns. What do we notice about the alleys in these 2 barns? Both are probably about a year old. So, what's this on this floor? Water. This is one's dry and one's soaking wet. They're both about a year old. I took this picture here about 3 months after the cows went in. Who do you think is going to have to foot bath more if this was the only barn this farm had? Right. This barn is going to guaranteed have to foot bath pretty much every single day, because those cows always have wet feet. They're always walking in puddles. So I was brave and asked the producer about this. I said, why is there so many puddles on your floor? His response was, well, my builder recommended it to me. He didn't want to have dry floors because he was afraid of it being slippery. So this is where I come back to the whole team approach. This is what his builder recommended, but if he would have talked to other members of his team, I'm pretty sure he would have got a different answer. But he went with what his builder recommended. And for the builder, it's a lot easier to build a barn like that than spend hours trying to get a floor that slopes towards the middle and drains one way. Because this is middle of the day, and this floor actually gets bone dry. There's a little bit more going on this floor, but still, just to illustrate the differences between the barns. Same thing here. Look at this cow's foot. My goal is I don't want any caked on manure above the dew claws. This cow's, I can tell this herd struggles with infectious foot lesions. These are relatively clean cows, but look at this. Where's she putting her foot? Is that her manure, or is that somebody else's manure? So we think flush burns might be a better way to go, but what happens to this cow? What is she being exposed to? There's things to consider. Sure, there's drawbacks to every system. So how do we actually reduce exposure to cow's feet? If you have a slatted floor barn, thankfully in the States there doesn't seem to be very many, but I think we need to scrape. If you have a slatted floor barn, it should be scraped. It's one way or another. The other option is to use alley scrapers. I personally am not a big fan of alley scrapers for this main reason. What happens to the cow that steps through this? She's going to get coated in manure. Now people might say, well, how much manure is on that alley if I'm only scraping it twice a day? Twice a day, there's probably, well, I would say there's less manure on it. 3 times a day, you can probably get away with just using tractor scrape. But I think there's a difference in where the manure is caked on in alley scrape barns versus tractor scrape barns. Because these cows in tractor scrape barns are never stepping through a tsunami of manure, hopefully. And probably the easiest thing you can do is provide a clean stall for the cow to lay down into. If we get her off her feet, she's not exposed to dirt and manure. And this is the same barn that I showed you with the clean, dry floors. This is a compromise with alley scrapers. So this is an alley scraper floor where actually all the liquids and manure ends up in this pipe underneath. And there's a paddle underneath that pushes all the liquids out. So this is a slope floor, sloped towards this pipe, and then all the manure and liquids gets pushed into this tube. It takes away the tsunami effect in front of the scraper. There's other issues I have with scrapers, but it takes away probably one of the biggest ones for infectious lesions. This cow is not stepping through the tsunami of manure before she steps over the scraper. Other things we need to focus on in infectious lesions is to treat existing preliminary lesions. We can focus on the whole herd or individual cows. So individual cow treatments, basically the one you're worried about is digital dermatitis, and probably the key is we can put whatever product you're comfortable putting on it, but if you use a wrap, we need to take it up. And please don't use duct tape, because duct tape is the perfect way to grow the bacteria if we leave it on for longer than 3 or 4 days, because it creates a nice oxygen or anaerobic environment, so there's no oxygen there, and then we have a perfect environment to grow strawberry foot rot again. So the biggest key is remove the wrap. There's actually some people now just putting a bit of tetracycline paste on feet and not putting any wraps on because they don't have the labor to go around to take the wraps off. So if we're going to talk about foot bathing, what's the number thing we should focus on? I think the first thing we should focus on is make it a routine. How often do people teat tip? It's a stupid question, right? Everybody teat tips a cow twice a day, 3 times a day when the cow gets milked. How often do we foot bath? People have to think about that. Most time I ask that question, they say, well, not every day. Maybe once, twice, 3 times a week. Well, if we're trying to come up with a program, trying to do something on a routine basis, how often can you brush your teeth twice a week and get away with it? Right? It's the same approach. There's various ways to automate it. We can use expensive toys, or we can use little medicator pumps to get our solution so we don't have to handle the solution. And we probably need to consider 2 foot baths that are separated so we can have the cow do their business in the water bath and walk through a cleaner solution bath. And we need to consider where we place these foot baths. This one is doing absolutely no good. This water bath is basically not preventing anything from getting into this bath. And then there's the automation, and just a big one for a double 50 parlor. We need to make sure they don't create bottlenecks for cows to go through out of the parlor, because I think that's part of the reason they don't get done often enough, because it becomes a bottleneck for cows to go through. So then when we look at what product do I use, I have a product. I basically come down to, I don't care what product you use as long as you use it on a routine basis. And by routine I mean at least in most herds, probably 5 times a week. The ones in red are ones that where I can go into the literature and find a little bit of evidence for it. And by a little bit, I mean there's 1 or 2 papers that maybe support their use. The other ones are basically all anecdotal products. But I think there's some keys. How do you pick a teat tip solution? What do you ask your milking equipment dealer when he brings you a new teat tip? There's certain questions we can ask. Does it meet NMC standards, so National Mastitis Council standards? We don't have those standards for foot bath products. And I think the company should be able to provide you more than a glossy brochure where 2 farmers say, yes, I use this product and it works in my herd. We need a little bit more evidence than that. Sure, it's nice to know that it works in a herd, but we need to have maybe a standard of how we evaluate these products. And some of the products are only disinfection products, and some of them are cleaning products. So we need to consider what products we're using and how we rotate them. I think we need to consider cost and safety, both to the environment and to the workers. That's where I think the biggest benefit to having an automated foot bath is. It takes away some of the worker safety issues with handling some of these chemicals. Just going to take a drink. So if we're going to focus on, we've addressed infectious lesions, now we're going to focus on preventing hoof-horn lesions. So these are the ulcers, the white line, and the abscesses. The number 1 goal is increased comfort. And just to reword it, we need to decrease or reduce standing time. Then we need to, I think, focus on ensuring proper weight bearing, and then focus on ensuring reducing metabolic stress. So how do we increase comfort? The easiest way to increase comfort is to use more bedding. There's nothing simpler than that. You put more bedding in a stall, the cow is more than likely going to use it more once. If that bedding happens to be sand, you're going to be more than happy because it automatically cleans your cow's feet too. And sand's probably the gold standard. But the main thing we can focus on for hoof-horn lesions is to increase cow comfort. I don't care how you do it, get your cows to lay down more often. They lay down for anywhere from 10 to 14 hours, and more is better. But that means they stand for the other amount of time, and less is better. And when they're standing, I think there's a benefit to having a softer surface, but there's also a drawback. And I think we need to consider where we place those rubber floors that everybody seems to be very keen to sell and put in your barn. But I don't think there's a place for a rubberized barn. I think we need to think about where the cow's standing. I think we need to consider forced standing. So where do we force the cow to stand? Probably the number 1 spot is the holding area. The cow has no choice but to stand there for an hour, stand facing uphill, and all she can do is go like this. Whereas if she's at the feed bunk, she can make a choice. She doesn't stand there probably for an hour. She stands there for 20 minutes to a half an hour, decides to walk, have a drink, decides to lay down, It's a different kind of standing. She has a choice to walk away, to have blood flow through her foot. But in the holding area, she's basically just a cow waiting her turn. So probably the number one spot I would put rubber is in the holding area and in the return alleys back. Because A, there's slope, and the forced standing time. Then the next spot, I'd maybe put it in the feed bunk, and that would probably be the amount. And maybe in front of water troughs, because they're all high traffic zones. But behind the stalls, I would probably never use it because I want some of that wear on the concrete. The other thing we need to consider is heat stress. And I apologize for putting these in centigrades, but it's about 68 degrees. In Wisconsin, this is Nigel Cook's stuff. He found standing time increased around 68 degrees. How many people turned their fans on at 68 to 70 degrees? In Ontario, when I asked that question, everybody's like, that's a nice day out. It's only 20 degrees. Right? But he found increased standing time. So if we're serious about increasing cow comfort, maybe we need to reconsider when we turn our fans on. In Ontario, the typical is 25 degrees, so that's probably around 80 Fahrenheit when we turn fans on. And I think in the past, probably 10 years, we focused a lot on what stalls. I'm sure we can walk around Expo and we can see the latest in stall design, but cow comfort is more than just the stall. It's everything put together. It's where she walks, where she lays, where she's milked, how long does she stand in the holding area. You'd be surprised how much time a cow actually spends waiting in the holding area. I'm not worried about the first cow into the parlor. I'm worried about the last cow in the parlor. How long? Some of that time, that's 3-4 hours out of that cow's day. So that means she only has 20 hours left to lay down. And if I want her to lay down for 12 to 14 hours, that doesn't leave a whole lot of time for moving her to the parlor for her to eat. And the first thing she cuts out when she's short on time is resting time. And then we need to observe cows. What are these cows telling us about these stalls? What are this cow telling us? What are these cows telling us? Take time, look at your cows and see what they're telling you in your barn. Same with these cows. What about this holding area? You can probably tell it's another cobblestone barn, same contractor as the first picture I showed, but this is a holding area. Cows stand there for a long time period. This is a brand new barn. He spent $1 million. I'm like, why? Rubber flooring. Sure, these cows are telling us something. They love to walk on it. I think we can all realize that. I think the next step, once we've focused on cow comfort, we need to ensure proper weight bearing. This is an actual picture. I saw this cow last week. She's beyond help. But the goal is normal hoof shape and balanced weight bearing. And I'm not going to stand up here and say this is how you should trim a cow, because I think there's lots of people that can do that. But I think hoof trimmers should have some training, and it needs to be a little bit more training than I worked with two weeks with a hoof trimmer with my buddy, and then I went out on my own. I think they need to go to a school. And there's several good schools around. So I think we need to do, and they have to leave you a piece of paper or let you know what they found on your barn. And I think most cows should at least be examined twice a year. And I said examined. I didn't say trimmed. I think some cows we can look up and say, you don't need to be don't have anything, put her back down. We don't need to touch the grinder. Just because we're paying for a cow doesn't mean we need to touch her foot with the grinder. And then there's simple things we can do to evaluate a hoof trim. Basically what we want to see is we want this to be at least 3 inches from the hairline down to the toe. We want a flat surface for the cow to walk on. So you want to be able to put your hoof knife up and down and not see any big dips right here. Same across the heels. If we can, we'd like to balance the heels. But this is the rough and dirty guide to how to judge a hoof trim. But there are tools available where we can say, this is what a foot should look like after she's been hoof trimmed. And then lastly, we want to minimize metabolic stresses. This is where the nutrition part comes in. I think the biggest thing is to prevent rumen acidosis. And I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that most paper rations are perfect. But what the cow actually eats is a whole different story. We need to focus on probably adequate fiber levels, but what's your mixing time? What's your order of putting it in the mixture? Those kind of things. Also, calving, prevent transition cow problems, because those same enzymes that get released during a bout of rumen acidosis get released when a toxic mastitis happens, when a toxic metritis happens, at calving time. So we need to ensure comfort of the cow's feet at that time. The worst things we can do to heifers is take them up from pasture or a pack barn, throw them into the stall after calving. But she's not adjusted to the concrete. We haven't told her anything. She just walks in and she goes, whoa, I'm full of woozy in my legs. I have loose ligaments. and I'm forced to stand and figure out the stall. Where do I stand? And this is the biggest, after giving this talk, the first question I usually get, what role do you think nutrition plays? I'm going to tell you my 90% rule. It's 90% of the lameness is due to something in the foot. 90% of the lesions are in the feet, are in the rear feet, and 90% of those are on the outside claw. And then what would we do? We say it's all the nutritionist's fault. I'd like to find a nutritionist that can do this, because I want him to feed my cows, because if he can do that specifically, if he can make every single lesion appear on the outside claw on 2 feet, he must know exactly what he's doing, because it's impossible. There's way more going on than just trying to blame these guys. It takes everything together. And just to summarize, we need to focus on finding and treating lame cows. If there's one thing I want you to walk out of this room with, is that we need to spend more time and energy and detail on finding lame cows. And then record the lesions, focus on clean, dry, comfortable feet, consider foot dipping, proper weight bearing, and minimize metabolic stresses. And just to conclude, lameness is a complex disease. There is no silver bullet. It takes a whole team approach. There's many lesions with lots of risk factors. It's a common disease. I think it's probably the #1 disease affecting the dairy industry, even worse than mastitis. And early detection and prevention are key. I want comfortable cows eating a dry and boring ration. I want that cow to know exactly what's going to happen to her an hour from now, 2 hours from now. And I still think we have some ways to go with building barns for today's dairy cows. And this is what drives me, more than her being my daughter. This is our consumer. This is our future consumer. I want her to think of happy, healthy cows, not of cows like this happening on the national news and her then going to visit this website. Because that's how we decrease our market. That's how we reduce our product sales. And just some acknowledgement. Some of the slides were taken from Chuck Card and Rodrigo, the ABP Lameness Committee, Adrian Gonzalez, and Dr. Dave Reed for inviting me to come and speak here.